As a rookie, it was easy to get overwhelmed. I remember standing in the patrol office waiting for roll call to begin. The first shift officers were wrapping up their day, excited to be getting off work. The second shift guys were making their way in, half-dressed and not nearly as happy as their day shift counterparts. The jokes and stories were flying. One officer talking about a bad wreck he'd worked that day. Another recounting the pursuit from last week to his buddy who'd just gotten back from vacation. I sat in the corner, taking it all in. My FTO came over and looked at me. I felt calm, but I guess my expression was giving a different vibe. He slapped me on the shoulder and said, "Let me give you a piece of advice my FTO gave me." He pointed back at the other officers, all trying to talk over each other. "Write it down. Write something down every day, and then, at the end of your career, you'll have a best-selling novel. You'll never have to work again." Unfortunately, my rookie self wasn't smart enough to take him up on his advice. I never wrote it down, and because of that, so many stories have slipped through the cracks. It's time to start telling our own stories. I'm Steve Kellums, and welcome to Blue Canary. Glenn Topping is someone who did write those things down, and because of that, he's gone on to write 6 novels. His first book, Look, a Quarter, details his journey from the military police to joining a Florida Sheriff's Department to finally retiring and becoming a novelist. Glenn has a unique perspective of law enforcement, having been involved at so many levels and in so many specialties over his more than 30-year career. And on top of all that, he was on the first season of Cops. Glenn, hello, and thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Your experiences in law enforcement, going way back into, when I was starting, you were already out there doing a lot of this stuff. I'm curious, how did you get involved in law enforcement?
Well, it all went back to when I was growing up in New York, a little kid, watching the cop shows on TV, Dragnet. And then later on, as I got a little bit older, it was like Adam 12. So these shows kind of interested me, even though I knew it was all television. It wasn't totally real. But it looked like it was a fun job, and maybe it was something I'd like to get into down the road. So that's how it started, watching these guys on TV. And then talking with the police that were in my neighborhood. They were always in there, just asking them, like, hey, what do you do? How's it going? How do you do this? Is it fun? Is it dangerous? And they kind of formed my mental state back then, which led me to think that, well, maybe if I'm looking to join the military, maybe I should go into the military police, which is what I did. After basic training, I joined the MPs, went to MP school in Fort Gordon, Georgia, got out of that, and I got my first assignment in Germany back in the early 70s. My first year was as a military police battalion working in a stockade, which was a pretrial jail before the criminal soldiers got shipped back to the States. And then about a year after that, I got promoted to sergeant, and I got put on a road patrol unit in Nuremberg, Germany, and that's where I finished my time.
So how did you end up in South Florida?
Well, that was kind of by accident. I had my best friend. We were living in New York, and my friend who goes down to Florida a lot because he had family down here. So listen, why don't you come down to Florida with me? We'll have a good time. It's like, I think it was spring break back then. And I go, okay, let's go. I've never been there. So I got on my first airplane ride on National Airlines from New York and came down. And we kind of fell in love with it. And we decided, well, maybe when we get out of high school, we'll go to school down here in Miami. So that's what we did. We both packed up and moved to Miami, got an apartment, and went to school here. Went to Miami-Dade Community College. And stayed here since then. That was in the late 70s.
You ended up writing about this, right? I mean, you've written 4 books. You're a published author, and that this was one of your books talked about your past, your background, and how you got involved in law enforcement.
Yeah, one of the books called Look, a Quarter shows about me growing up in New York, going through the military and through living in Miami and going through policing and to where I am today. And the Look, a Quarter name of the book was because my friend and I in New York were stuck at this amusement park when we were little kids. And we had no more money left. We were hungry. So we're on the ground looking for change underneath the gaming machines. So at the same time, we kind of looked at each other and go, hey, look, a quarter. So that's how we came up with the name of the book. And I kind of explain that in the book.
So when you end up in South Florida, you end up looking at law enforcement and getting into policing. I'm curious, what year did you start? And then what was the training like, the initial training that you got to do the job?
Well, I started with a small town down here called in the city of Dania, which is a beach town in Broward County. I originally started off with them as a reserve officer. So I had to go through a 200 hour police academy to become a reserve officer. And then I did a lot of time. I came in after work. I came in whenever they needed me. I made myself known. And it seemed like just maybe 2 or 3 months later, I get called in and they go, listen, you're interested in coming on full time. And I go, yeah, sure. That's like my whole idea. So, okay, so you're going to have your interview to be hired. And I did. It was like a 2-minute interview because they knew me. And then I had to go back to the police academy again for the normal 5-month police academy, which was, the typical police academy, jumping, running, shooting, driving, classroom law classes, which is pretty much how it is still today.
How much time, I know you've done a lot of things in your career. How much time did you spend? Did you move through a lot of these positions pretty quickly? Did it take a long time to develop into those next steps of your career, or did it just kind of stumble into it?
Well, I was always looking to go one step above what I was doing. My heart was always with patrol. I always had a good time doing that. I worked a lot of hours. I worked a lot of overtime. I got myself known. I was very aggressive and proactive on the road. I was making a lot of arrests, a lot of drug arrests, and that's where my career kind of put me in later on. So then in 1988, the Broward County Sheriff annexed that city of Dania for policing, and we all became sworn in as deputy sheriffs. And then from there, we branched out, and from patrol, the benefits were better. We got a take-home car. There were a lot more opportunities to do things. And that's when my boss asked me if I was interested in working any kind of investigations. And I said, well, yeah, I like road patrol, but, it always leads to the investigation end too. So I started doing some basic investigation with property crimes.
So you also got involved in being in the first season of Cops, correct?
Yes. I was called into my chief's office, and I see this guy in a suit sitting with him. And I think, oh, what did I do wrong? He goes, this guy is with this TV show Cops. And I go, what's that? And he goes, well, it's a new TV show. It's a reality show. They're going to ride with the officers, film everything you do. And that's the show. And I said, are you interested in doing it? I said, oh, yeah, sure. It sounds like fun. So I got picked to be on the show, and that was in 1989, the first season, and I was in about 4 or 5 episodes.
That's I've been pretty critical of media in Hollywood. When Cops, though, came around at a time when they didn't like us as police, we definitely were kind of looked down upon. Hollywood wasn't doing us any favors either, but
No.
They actually had a whole different approach at that time, trying to get the real view behind policing. And so what was your experiences with those film crews whenever they first climbed in the car?
Well, it was kind of a little scary at first because, you get the guy with the camera staring at you on the side next to you in the front seat. Then you had the sound guy in the back seat. They had IDs from the sheriff's office. They had carte blanche. They can go anywhere they want. And they said, just do what you normally do on patrol. Forget we're here, which was kind of hard to do, but forget we're here and just go about your calls. Whatever call you go on, handle it however you would handle it, but we will not get involved. Okay, so if you're in a fight, that's life. Call for backup, right? So they rode with me. They were in the car with me for maybe, I don't know, almost a week on and off. Because they would do with my shift and go to another place and come back. And we had a good rapport. They were real nice guys. We had a good time with it. They filmed whatever they filmed, and it was interesting seeing you on TV a week later.
Now, I'm curious, did you change, or did you see that the opinions of the cameramen and the crew change as they spent time with you out there actually doing the job?
Well, their opinions were, they were very pro law enforcement. They would tell us all the time that, we love the police. We love what they do. We don't like when people badmouth them, but that's the way of the world today. And it was no problem. We had a good time. They liked their job. They thought that this would kind of put the cops out there in a different light, to hopefully see what they really go through every day.
And I think it definitely did. I think it was groundbreaking for what it was trying to do. And I think you saw everything else kind of spin off of that. So it's always interesting to me to see whenever Hollywood does a different approach than what we're used to with law enforcement. Now, you
Yes.
got involved heavily in investigations. You talked about that next step at Broward County.
Yes.
Whenever they threw you into those investigations, how did they prepare you for that?
Well, you had to go to a basic 40-hour detective school, basically, to learn how to do interviews and interrogations, how to write tactical reports, and just basically how to deal with people on a different level once the crime is over. And so I did that, and I started doing some property crime. And then an opening came up in the organized crime division where my boss asked me, "Hey, you interested in doing that?" I said, "Well, yeah, of course. What would I be doing?" I said, "Well, we're not sure, but you have to go meet with them and see what they want you to do." So I interviewed with the commander of the organized crime unit, and they went over my background and they looked at all the arrests I made and all the drug seizures I made, and they go, "Okay, listen, we'd like to have you in the unit, and you'll work in the drug interdiction unit, which would be at the airport and the bus terminals. It'll be plain clothes, and you'll grab dope and guns, whatever's coming through the airport." I said, "Great. When do I start?" And I did.
I know that when I worked narcotics, it was one of the funnest times of my career. Would you say the same?
Yeah, we had a blast, especially working in the airport. We got a lot of bad guys, got a lot of cocaine, a lot of marijuana, a lot of guns. Oh yeah.
So did you get tips of them coming into the airport? Were you just setting up and doing a lot of surveillance, looking for them as they were getting off and picking up luggage and moving to their cars? How did you go about digging into those investigations at the airport?
Yeah, exactly. At the airport, we did a lot of profiling, which really wasn't looked on very well back then. But we had a lot of profiling. That we had a certain amount of things we looked for. Like we'd see somebody coming into the Fort Lauderdale Airport in a Miami cab. Like, why are you taking a Miami cab up to Fort Lauderdale Airport? You have a big airport in Miami. Then we watched the guy walk to the terminal, to the counter where they would buy the ticket, carrying one bag. They would check the bag in, and they would get there, they would pay for their ticket, and then they would walk away. And then we would confront them and identify ourselves with the sheriff's office. We'd work narcotics. Would you be carrying anything you shouldn't be having today? "Oh, no, I'm good." "Okay. Do you have any checked bags?" "No, I don't have any checked bags." "Okay, just stand by here." So myself or my partner would go and grab the bag that he just checked off the conveyor belt and walk up to him and say, "This isn't your bag?" And he go, "No, it's not my bag." "Okay." And we found out that they paid cash for their ticket, which normally most people won't. So we'd open the bag, and what's in it? A kilo or two of cocaine, the guy's license or an ID, and then we would make the arrest on the possession charge or the trafficking charge. And then a lot of times we would just we would do a substantial assistance on the guy, maybe roll him over to the next bad guy.
You said something really interesting that I want to talk about because, you said profiling, and then of course you said it's kind of looked on badly, but I think there's a huge misconception that people have on profiling. Racial profiling is bad. Criminal
Different.
profiling is good. That's what we're
Right.
supposed to be doing. And that's exactly what you're talking about here, looking
Yes.
for people that are doing all the steps to commit a crime,
Yeah.
not caring about what their ethnicity might be, but solely
No.
about their behavior, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. We didn't care what you look like or what nothing like that. There were certain characteristics that we looked for, and sometimes we were wrong, and there's nothing going on, but a lot of times we were right, and we got a lot of good stuff out of that airport.
Of course, back in the 80s, the cartels are moving a lot of the cocaine through Florida, so you guys had to be incredibly busy.
Well, it was like nonstop. I mean, could have used another 10 guys to help us out. It was more fun really during the holiday season, like in Christmas time, because there were people bringing gifts in through the airport, and they would have to go through the X-ray machine. We would see kilos of cocaine in boxes of gifts. We would see kilos of cocaine packaged in computer terminals. It was just like one thing after the other.
What was one of your biggest busts out of the airport? One of your biggest seizures?
Well, several of them. One we had with, I think we had 6 kilos coming through on gifts. And then we happened to, when we made the arrest, we said, "Listen, you're facing right now 25 years in prison plus a $250,000 fine. But if you want to turn us on to the guy you're delivering it to, maybe the state attorney will drop some of the charges and drop some of the fine." And most of the time they would. So if we had a very big seizure, we would get DEA involved with us. We would call them up because they had an office in the airport. and then they would basically take over the case, and they would we would roll the guy over and work out the next part of the deal, which would be like in New York. We would hold the guy overnight in the jail. We'd keep the drugs. We'd take the guy out of jail the next day. DEA would get us all plane tickets. We would all get on the airplane with carrying the dope, and then we would meet the other bad guy at the airport in New York. And then once that guy would come by to pick up the drugs, then we'd pick him up and roll him over onto the next guy, which led us to a drug lab right across the street from one of the colleges in New York, which was one of the very few drug labs back then that they were finding.
Now that you're talking about leading to New York, and you talked about being organized crime, were you focused mostly on the traditional mafia families or on the cartels at that time?
Well, it was just really on more the smugglers coming through the airport, because we would get calls from New York, from DEA and customs, that, hey, you got a guy coming down with 200,000 in cash or 80,000 in cash. You might want to stop him and see what he's up to. And most of the time, they were coming down to buy drugs, getting a little rubber band money, in their suitcase. And they would say, well, we're here to buy a boat, or we're here to buy this. And go, sure you are. So we would seize the money from them, knowing that it's to buy drugs. And we'd give them a receipt. And we'd listen, if you want your money back, come back with a valid reason where you got all this money. And we'd ask them a series of questions about, what they do for work, when was the last time they paid taxes, something like a couple of IRS type questions. And a lot of times they didn't have the answers. So we would keep the money, and they would leave, and they would never come back for the money.
It's amazing because as you got involved in narcotics investigations and smuggling investigations in the late 80s, I did it a decade later, and it doesn't seem like it changed that much.
It really hasn't. I mean, even I watched that TV show to Catch a Smuggler. Other than they have a little more advanced today with the equipment and how they're doing things, it's basically the same thing.
Now, when we look at, again, late 80s, early 90s, that's oftentimes looked as some of the most violent times in law enforcement, particularly with the crack epidemic, the inner city violence, the gang violence that was taking place. What were some of the experiences that you had with that violent crime while you're working the job at what's arguably some of the most violent time in law enforcement history?
Well, we didn't really have too much of the gang issue where I worked. There might have been a couple of wannabes, but other than that, it really wasn't that big of an issue. But the moving of the drugs around, where the SWAT team had to get involved with a lot of times, there was always a shootout between the SWAT guys and the bad guys, and of course the SWAT guys always won. They were really dropping them like flies at some of these shootouts they've had over the years, all because of narcotics. It was mainly the Jamaican gang, Jamaican posse, moving a lot of dope around, and some Latin types moving the dope around. And then every once in a while, we get some guys that were in like biker gangs that were heavily into moving drugs around.
What we've seen lately with the defund the police movements, the legalization of marijuana pushes some of these legalized injection sites in a few of the cities in the United States. What are your thoughts on this really loosening up of the drug laws and the argument that, the war on drugs is lost? What are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, when I heard about it, I thought I heard wrong. Like, what do you mean? You want to legalize marijuana? That we have enough impaired people driving around on the road as it is now. Why do you want to put more on the road? And then you want to have these drug dens where they want to legalize every drug you can think of, so they can do it in one particular spot. They can shoot up. They can take heroin. They can fentanyl, whatever they want to do. I mean, it's so absurd. And this is what they want our tax money to go to. I'm totally against it. I mean, the legalizing of even medical marijuana, I'm really against, because it's a farce. Everybody all of a sudden has a medical marijuana card. My hair hurts, I need medical marijuana. My fingernails hurt, I need a marijuana card. And if you look at some of the states where marijuana is legal, not just for medical purposes, look at their increase in impaired drivers. It's gone up a lot.
I very much agree with you. I think the statistics are pretty clear when you start looking at the states that have legalized marijuana, even for medical purposes as well as recreational. I always thought it was funny. You talked about the medical marijuana. It's hilarious how you walk in to get your medical marijuana card at the same place that they sold the fireworks on the 4th of July. So you can't really tell me that has anything to do with medicine, right?
It's just like, there's pharmacies, it must be about health, but they're selling cigarettes and vaping and cigars and marijuana.
Right, right. And that's the other thing that I've always told everybody. I've never said that the use of marijuana is going to make you a hardcore drug user, but every hardcore drug user used marijuana. I've never seen a hardcore drug user that didn't use marijuana.
Right. You got to start somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's very much a gateway drug, and
I think it is too.
We could spend a lot of time and piss off a lot of people talking about how the legalization of marijuana is a bad idea. I say you only have to look at what's kind of going on in the state of Colorado to see it's not really a good idea. No, it's all about the money, right?
That's all it is about the money and making a ton of money. I mean, the country, the states are taxing the hell out of them. But listen, some of these marijuana places are making good money.
I do want to go back and touch base with the violent crime because it's such a big issue right now in law enforcement. I know that, just recently from us recording this episode that we had 13 officers shot in 1 week. And that number is staggering when you look at, the law enforcement interactions with people. And a lot of those were ambush type violence against police officers. And many people will say back in the 90s, whenever you were doing it, that that was more violent than today. But it seems like the targeting is very different.
I think it's much more violent today for police than it is. It's so appalling to see these people take advantage. And, I blame the city mayors and the DAs. Then I put these people in jail where they belong initially before they go out and do these things. Today the ambush is the word of the day. This is what they like to do because then they can sneak up on these guys and get away with it. Back when I was working, you didn't really hear much about ambush shootings. You just maybe walked up on a crime in progress and you had to engage somebody. Unfortunately, in my agency, before I retired in 2009, we had 5 deputies shot and killed in the line of duty. Not all close together, but responding to crimes, maybe domestic violence or robberies. Not like it is today where, you're just targeted, for being in your car. You're targeted for walking down the street. It's absolutely horrible.
You talked about the DAs, and that's something that we're seeing really big is these, district attorneys and prosecutors across the United States getting elected and then pushing their own political agendas and not enforcing laws, allowing criminals back out on the streets. We're seeing many of these offenders being repeat violent offenders that the prosecutor's office refused to take charges on or refused to follow through with and keeping them in jail.
Yeah, it's horrible.
That's really different than what we used to see back in the 90s, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Plus, you add to that the no cash bails. Right, you can do a bank. They had a guy he did bank robbery in New York. He had no cash bail. He went and did another bank robbery. So what's the point?
So how many years did you spend in the organized crime investigations?
I did it almost just under 2 years. Because the deal was that whatever seizures we made in money or property, half of it went to the agency I was working with.
After wrapping up that time with organized crime, what did you end up doing? What did you get into?
I went back to being a patrol supervisor, and then I went and I applied for a position and got on the hostage negotiation team on the SWAT team, and I was on that for 13 years.
That's a high stress position.
Yeah, it was, to say the least.
And of course, you guys were probably really busy there in Broward County.
It was busy, no doubt. I mean, I started off, basically, as a new guy, and whenever we got a call out, I went with the lead negotiator and another negotiator just to see how things are done, and then eventually I worked my way up to where I got most of the call outs, and I became the lead negotiator, not the head negotiator, but the lead guy, and I got called out on many calls, all hours of the day and night. I got called off shift sometime, which was okay with me. And went to wherever I had to go, to a barricaded subject, to a suicide attempt, you name it, we went out on.
What kind of training did they give you in preparation for that job?
Well, first you had to have an interview with the team and the SWAT commander. And then after you went through that, you had to go sit with the psychiatrist, and you had to go through all these psychological testing, these MMPI classes, these tests, where you had one test that had like 500 questions, another one had 600 questions, another had 200 questions. And then after that, if you came out okay, actually when you came out, you felt like you needed a psychiatrist, you were picked for the team. And then you started going through, then you had to go through a class that was put on by the negotiator, by the lead negotiator. And then once you got through that, you had to do a practical exercise where they pretended you were in one room, and then you had to talk to this guy in another room who was holding somebody hostage, and you had to kind of converse with them to try to let this person go. And then after that, you got put on the team.
Do you remember the first one you had to do, and did you feel like you were ready for it?
It was a little nerve wracking. We had a guy that was barricaded. It was a suicide. It was attempted suicide. And of course, on that one particular one, we're down the street in this lady's kitchen, and we're talking to this guy on the phone. And of course, the sheriff has to show up and sit down next to me. And he's like, can you hurry this up? This is costing me a lot of overtime.
That sounds like every sheriff I know.
I said, well, Sheriff, I'm trying to do my best here, please. Okay. And we weren't there very long, maybe a couple hours. But it was like, my voice is quivering, and like I got the boss sitting next to me, and he's wondering like, why is it taking so long? And he's looking at dollar signs. And finally, the guy gave up and he came out, and he was taken into custody and Baker acted. But that was probably the first one that I remember. But then it got crazier after that.
You've had such an interesting career, starting in patrol, making your way up through the patrol into organized crime and narcotics enforcement, being on the cop show, doing the hostage negotiator stuff, and then you end up in executive protection, right?
Well, it wasn't really executive protection. This was before policing. I was working as a bodyguard in the musical entertainment field.
So that was before you got involved.
That was before. That was before law enforcement. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So did you bring anything from that, any skill sets from that into law enforcement?
Well, I did a little bit because in the sheriff's office, we did some bodyguard work for certain people when it was called for. And I had flashbacks when I did it with these rock and roll bands back in the 80s. So a little bit carried over. I mean, a little bit different. We're in a law enforcement capacity as being not in one back then. But yeah, it was a lot of it was almost the same thing. Just watch your guy. That was it.
So everybody loves the 80s. I mean, I got to know which bands were you working protection for?
Oh God, there's so many. We did it when they came into town to do the show, and then they wanted protection for the band or for the group or the individual. We had Billy Joel, Neil Diamond. I worked with AC/DC, Van Halen, Journey. There was so many in the 80s when they came in for the shows. And sometimes they were overnight shows, so we had to stay in the hotel with them, take them to and from sound checks, then stay with them, on the stage until they got off the stage, get them back on their bus, and then they leave.
As you wrap up your career and you retire, you start writing books about your experiences. Somebody told me early on that I need to write something down every day, because if you do, you'll have a book at the end. And it sounds like that's exactly what you did.
Yes. Well, it wasn't every day, but when I was working in this rock and roll club back in the 80s, we had a drive-by shooting homicide of one of the bouncers after we threw some guys out. They made a threat to come back with a machine gun and kill us all. Well, we heard that numerous times during the month when we were throwing people out. So finally, we at this one particular night, we're outside. And I'm sitting in my car and giving my friend a ride home. There's a bunch, maybe like 15 or 18 people in the parking lot leaving. And my friend goes, "Hey, don't back up. There's a car behind us." I said, "Okay." So I look at my right, and his car is driving by, and I noticed what looked like a rifle barrel sticking out the window. And all of a sudden, bang, bang, bang. And my windows get shot out of my car while I'm sitting in it. And then the car peels off out of the parking lot, and people are on the ground screaming and yelling. So I get up and I get out and I look out, and the car is gone, and everybody's getting up except this one kid who was one of the bouncers. Apparently, he got shot in the back. So I run over to him and I get on the ground with him and I pull him up into my lap and I stick my finger in the bullet hole in his back, trying to stop the bleeding, but it was useless. Then very short time later, the paramedics come, the police come, they take the guy to the hospital where he died. Then the guys that did the shooting, about a mile or two down the road, they get into an accident, and the police handle the accident, not knowing these guys were just involved in a shooting. So they do the accident report and then they leave. Then we find out later on that they got rid of the car and some kind of a car crusher. They got rid of the rifle and they both fled the area. Several months later, we got word that they found out who these guys were and where they were, and they brought them back for trials. So it took 3 trials to get one guy convicted of first-degree murder and the other guy 1 trial. And they both got sent up to northern Florida to prison. So while there, about 7 years later, one of the guys gets raped in prison and contracts AIDS. And the family pleads with the governor if they can give him a pardon so he can go home and die instead of dying in prison, which I believe they granted. Then about a year later, the other guy escapes in a laundry truck and is on the run for over 10 years before the U.S. Marshals finally catch him and bring him back to jail. So then the book carries over back into the Rock and Roll Club, which was back then it was all sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And it carried all the antics and the fights and the sex and the overdoses and whatever you name it. And actually did a lot of rock concerts there too. And that's what the book basically covers. That's why I got to know Johnny Depp, who was a kind of an acquaintance of mine.
Oh, at the club as you were
at the club, yeah.
Looking at all your experiences and seeing where law enforcement, where we're at today, you have any final words for the cops out there that are listening right now and hearing about your experiences? Any words for them and what they're doing?
Well, unfortunately, today's atmosphere is totally different than it was many years ago. You got the body cams. You got, as soon as you walk out of your car, you're getting filmed by somebody or numerous people hoping you do something wrong. I'll just tell everybody, just do your job, do what you're paid to do, use your training and nothing more. Once the handcuffs go on somebody, the fight's over. Don't lie. If you lie, your credibility is shot, because then you go to court, and as soon as you go, what the defense attorney is going to ask and bring it up. You go, didn't you lie? Are you lying now or are you lying then? Which one is it? So you don't want to do that. And if the opportunities are there, go up the ladder. I mean, there are some people that like to stay at patrol level, which is fine, but go up the ladder, see what else is out there for you, and make yourself a better police officer, and be proud to the profession. It's a loyal profession, and it's noble.
Glenn, thanks so much for sharing your story with us.
I appreciate it. Thanks very much.
And that's the story we have to tell. Thank you for joining. As always, I'm curious what questions you're getting asked. What isn't the news covering? What story needs to be told? Connect with me at bluecanarypodcast@gmail.com.